Real stories. Extreme survival. No fiction. Welcome to Stories by Candlelight.
The year was 1959. The Cold War was at its peak, and the Soviet Union was a land of secrets, hidden military installations, and vast, unexplored wilderness. In the heart of this frozen empire, a group of 10 young elite explorers prepared for a journey that would change history, not because of what they achieved, but because of the terrifying mystery they left behind. These were the students of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. They weren't just hobbyists, they were highly trained Grade 2 hikers, on the verge of earning their Grade 3 certification, the highest honor an explorer could achieve in the USSR. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women. Each of them was physically fit, mentally sharp, and deeply experienced in winter survival. They packed their diaries, their cameras, and enough supplies to last for weeks in the brutal Siberian winter. They left the city of Sverdlovsk with smiles on their faces, singing songs and joking about the challenges ahead. To them, the Ural Mountains were a playground, a place to test their strength against the elements. But the mountain they were heading toward, Kalat-Syak, had a different reputation among the local indigenous Mansi people. They called it the Mountain of the Dead. For centuries, legends whispered that the mountain was cursed, a place where people vanished without a trace. The hikers, being modern Soviet citizens, dismissed these stories as primitive superstition. They had no idea that the mountain was about to live up to its name. The expedition began smoothly. They traveled by train and truck to the northernmost settlements, eventually reaching a small village called Vizhai. This was the last outpost of civilization. From here, there would be no more roads, no more houses, only the deep, silent taiga. On January 28th, the group faced its first setback. One of the members, Yuri Yudin, began to suffer from severe joint pain and a high fever. It was a crushing blow for the young man who had trained so hard for this trip. In a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, he hugged his friends goodbye and watched them disappear into the white horizon. He was devastated to be left behind, but he didn't realize that his illness was a miracle. By turning back, he became the only member of the Dyatlov group who would survive the month. For the next several days, the remaining 9 hikers pushed deeper into the wilderness. We know the details of these days because of the diaries they kept and the photographs they took. They skied across frozen rivers, built fires in the snow, and slept in a large communal canvas tent. Their entries show a group in high spirits. They wrote about the beauty of the snow-covered trees and the biting cold that turned their breath into ice. But as they approached the slopes of Kalat-Syak on February 1st, the weather began to turn. A massive snowstorm moved in, dropping visibility to near zero. The wind became a violent, howling force that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. In the middle of this blinding storm, the group drifted off course. Instead of heading toward their intended destination, Mount Oderton, they found themselves climbing the exposed slope of Kalat-Syak. Realizing their mistake, they made a choice that still puzzles experts. Instead of descending a few hundred meters back into the forest, where the trees would have provided a natural windbreak and wood for a fire, they decided to set up camp right there on the open, treeless slope. Perhaps they were too exhausted to move.
Perhaps Dyatlov didn't want to lose the altitude they had already gained. They dug a shallow pit in the snow, leveled the ground, and pitched their tent on the frozen earth, completely exposed to the elements. Inside the tent, they tried to make themselves comfortable. They shared a meal of cold ham and crackers, as they couldn't start a fire on the open slope. They took off their heavy outer coats and boots to dry them, settling into their sleeping bags for the night. The final photograph recovered from their camera shows the group setting up the camp in the fading light, looking tired but determined. There was no sign of fear, no sign that anything was wrong. But sometime in the deep hours of the night, something changed. Something so horrific and sudden occurred that these 9 experienced, brave individuals lost all sense of logic. The investigators who found the tent weeks later were horrified by what they saw. The tent was still partially standing, covered in a layer of snow, but it was sliced open from the inside. This wasn't a neat exit. These were long, jagged slashes made in total desperation. It was as if the people inside believed that even a second longer in that tent meant certain death. They didn't even grab their shoes. They didn't grab their coats. They abandoned their only source of heat and shelter in a -30-degree blizzard. They ran. But they didn't run in a panic-stricken scatter. The footprints left in the snow showed that they moved together, walking in a line down the slope toward the distant forest. Some were barefoot, their toes sinking into the razor-sharp ice. Others were only a single sock. Imagine the sheer terror required to make a human being choose the certain death of a Siberian night over staying inside their tent. What could have been inside that tent with them? Or what was outside, trying to get in? The tracks led a mile down the mountain to a giant cedar tree at the edge of the woods. This is where the search teams found the first evidence of the tragedy. Under the tree were the frozen bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were dressed only in their underwear. Their hands were charred, showing that they had desperately tried to keep a small fire going, even as their bodies were shutting down from the cold. Above them, the branches of the cedar tree were snapped up to 5 meters high. This suggested that one of them had climbed the tree in a frenzy, perhaps trying to see back toward the tent, or perhaps hiding from something on the ground. The discovery of the first 2 bodies was only the beginning. Between the cedar tree and the tent, the searchers found 3 more bodies: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They were spaced out in the snow, their bodies pointing back toward the tent. It appeared that after reaching the forest, they had realized their mistake and were trying to crawl back to their supplies. But the mountain was heartless. One by one, they collapsed in the snow, freezing to death just a few hundred meters from safety. At this point, the authorities thought they had a simple, albeit tragic case of hypothermia. But they hadn't found the other 4 hikers yet. And when they finally did, the story would turn from a tragic accident into a dark, inexplicable nightmare that would involve crushed bones, missing organs, and traces of radiation that should not have existed.
The discovery of the first 5 bodies on the slopes of Kolatsiak had already sent shockwaves through the Soviet investigative teams. But the true horror was buried deeper, hidden under meters of packed snow and ice. It would take another 2 months of searching, as the winter sun slowly began to thaw the Ural Mountains, before the remaining 4 hikers were found. On May 4th, 1959, the searchers noticed a trail of cut branches leading toward a ravine about 75 meters away from the large cedar tree where the first 2 bodies had been discovered. There, buried under 4 meters of snow, lay the final members of the Dyatlov group: Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Alexander Kolevatov. At first, the searchers expected to see the same signs of hypothermia they had found in their friends. But as they cleared the snow, they realized this was something entirely different. These 4 were better dressed than the others. It appeared that in a final, desperate act of survival, they had taken the clothes off their dead friends back at the cedar tree to protect themselves from the freezing wind. But clothes couldn't save them from what had happened next. When the bodies were brought to the morgue in Ivdel, the medical examiners were stunned. These 4 hikers had not died from the cold. They had died from massive, violent trauma, injuries that defied every logical explanation. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles had a massive fracture in his skull. The force required to create such an injury was immense, yet there was no external wound on his scalp. It was as if his skull had been crushed by an invisible hand. But the injuries to Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov were even more terrifying. Both had their chests completely crushed. Their ribs were broken with such violence that the doctors compared the internal damage to the impact of a high-speed car crash or a massive explosion. One of the fragments of Dubinina's ribs had even pierced her heart. And yet, just like the skull fracture, there were no bruises, no cuts, and no soft tissue damage on their skin. Something had crushed the very bones inside their bodies without leaving a single mark on the outside. How was this possible? What kind of force can shatter a human skeleton while leaving the skin intact? The horror didn't stop at broken bones. When the medical examiner looked at Lyudmila Dubinina's face, he found a scene from a nightmare. Her tongue was missing. It hadn't been cut out. It was gone from the very root. Her eyes were absent from their sockets. Part of her upper lip and facial tissue were also missing. Later, it was discovered that Semyon Zolotaryov was also missing his eyes. While skeptics would later point to small animals or natural decomposition in the running water of the ravine, the forensic reports contained a chilling detail. There was a significant amount of blood in Dubinina's stomach. This suggested that she was still alive when her tongue was removed. The level of brutality was beyond anything the investigators had ever seen in the wilderness. As the autopsies continued, another bizarre element emerged. A specialist brought a Geiger counter into the morgue to test the victim's clothing. To everyone's shock, the device began to click rapidly. The clothing worn by the hikers in the ravine, specifically the sweaters and trousers, showed highly elevated levels of beta radiation. This discovery turned a local mystery into a national security issue. Why would a group of students hiking in the middle of nowhere be contaminated with radioactive isotopes? The Soviet Union was known for its secret nuclear tests and closed cities, but there were no official records of any tests in the northern Urals at that time. The investigation was now spiraling into a web of conspiracy and fear. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, began receiving strange reports from other groups in the area. Another team of hikers, camping about 50 kilometers away, claimed that on the very night the Dyatlov group died, they saw strange, glowing orange spheres floating in the sky. These spheres moved silently above the peaks of the Ural Mountains, appearing and disappearing without a sound. Local Mansi hunters also came forward, describing similar lights that had been seen for weeks. Was it possible that these 9 students had accidentally witnessed a secret military test? Could the compelling force that crushed their bones have been the shockwave of an experimental weapon or a falling rocket? The Soviet authorities were growing impatient. They wanted the case closed,
and they wanted it closed quickly. They didn't want the public talking about radiation, missing tongues, or UFOs. The official conclusion was released in May 1959, and it was perhaps the most frustrating sentence in legal history. It stated that the hikers had died due to an unknown compelling force, which the hikers were unable to overcome. No blame was assigned. No further investigation was allowed. The area was closed off to hikers and civilians for the next 3 years. The files were gathered, stamped as secret, and buried in a government archive. For the families of the victims, this was an insult. They knew their children were experienced and brave. They didn't just walk into the snow and die for no reason. They suspected a cover-up. They suspected that the military had killed them, either by accident or to keep a secret. But in the Soviet Union of the 1950s, you didn't argue with the state. The mystery was officially solved, but the truth was farther away than ever. The Dyatlov Pass incident was now a ghost story, a legend whispered in the halls of the university, waiting for someone to find the courage to reopen the files and look into the eyes of the compelling force that claimed 9 young lives on the Mountain of the Dead.
As the official investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident was abruptly shut down, the vacuum of information was filled by something much more persistent: the theories of those who refused to believe the government's vague explanation. For decades, the families of the hikers and independent researchers have pored over the redacted files, looking for the truth behind the unknown compelling force. The more they looked, the more the evidence pointed away from a simple natural disaster and towards something far more secretive and dangerous. One of the most persistent theories involves the secret military activities of the Soviet Union. You have to remember the context of 1959. The space race was in full swing, and the Cold War was at a boiling point. The Ural Mountains, remote and sparsely populated, were the perfect testing ground for new experimental technology. This leads us to the orange spheres. On the very night of February 1st, multiple witnesses, including other hiking groups and local residents, reported seeing glowing orange orbs floating silently in the sky above the northern Urals. Even the lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, eventually admitted that he believed these spheres played a direct role in the group's death. Could these have been R-7 Semyorka missiles or other experimental rockets launched from the Turatom or Kaspakin Yar test sites? If a missile had malfunctioned and exploded in the atmosphere above Kalatsiakal, it would explain several of the mystery's most baffling details. A high-altitude explosion would create a massive pressure wave, a shock wave. This kind of force could easily crush a human chest or fracture a skull without leaving a single bruise on the skin, perfectly matching the injuries found on Dubinina and Zolotaryov. It would also explain why the hikers fled their tent in such a panic. If they heard a terrifying roar in the sky or saw a blinding light approaching, they wouldn't have waited to put on their boots. They would have cut the tent and run for their lives. Then there is the matter of the radiation. Why was there radioactive contamination on the clothing of the hikers found in the ravine? In the 1950s, the Soviet military was experimenting with various nuclear-powered projects. Some theorists suggest the hikers might have stumbled into a drop zone for a secret weapon or a radioactive fuel component. There are even rumors that Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group, was actually a KGB agent sent on a secret mission to meet foreign operatives in the mountains for a controlled delivery of radioactive samples. According to this theory, the meeting went horribly wrong, and the hikers were liquidated to ensure their silence. While this sounds like a spy movie, the fact that Zolotaryov had tattoos that his family didn't recognize and was buried in a separate cemetery only adds fuel to the fire. Another chilling possibility is the infrasound theory. When wind of a certain speed and direction hits the unique shape of a mountain peak, it can create something called a Kármán vortex street. This produces infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that are below the limit of human hearing, but have a devastating effect on the human brain. Scientists have proven that infrasound can cause intense feelings of dread, panic, nausea, and even hallucinations. Imagine the 9 hikers inside their tent, suddenly hit by an invisible wave of sound that makes their hearts race and their minds fracture with irrational terror. In their madness, they might have believed the tent was a trap, slashing it open to escape a threat that existed only in their minds. Once they were out in the cold, the logic returned, but by then it was too late. The mountain had already won. But what about the indigenous Mansi people? For a long time, the authorities suspected that the hikers might have been murdered by Mansi hunters for trespassing on sacred ground. After all, Kholat Syakhl was the mountain of the dead. However, this theory quickly fell apart. The Mansi were known to be peaceful and had a good relationship with the Soviet students. More importantly, the snow around the tent showed no other footprints. There were no signs of a struggle, no bullet wounds, and no evidence of anyone else being on that slope that night. The Mansi themselves were terrified of the area where the hikers died, claiming that the sky had killed them. As years turned into decades, the Soviet Union collapsed and more documents were leaked. We learned that the hikers' bodies were supposedly tanned or had a deep orange hue, and that their funeral was handled with extreme secrecy, with some families being told not to open the coffins. There are even reports that several of the hikers had gray hair when they were found, as if they had been aged by extreme stress or chemical exposure in a single night. Was it a botched military test, a secret KGB sting operation, or did they encounter something truly paranormal? Some even suggest an encounter of the third kind, pointing to the missing eyes and tongues as signs of extraterrestrial biological sampling. While science looks for rational answers, the evidence at Dyatlov Pass remains stubbornly irrational. The more we learn about the secret weapons and the orange spheres of the 1950s, the more it seems that these 9 students didn't just die from a storm. They died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a country that valued its secrets more than the lives of its citizens. The silence of the mountain is deep, but the secrets of the Soviet state may be even deeper.
For over 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident was a mystery that lived in the shadows of the Cold War. But in the age of modern technology, the world wasn't satisfied with the answer of an unknown compelling force. In 2019, due to mounting pressure from the families of the victims and the international media, the Russian Prosecutor General's office made a historic announcement. They were officially reopening the investigation. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. They sent a team of modern forensic experts, mountaineers, and scientists back to the exact slope of Kholat Syakhl, equipped with tools that the investigators of 1959 could only dream of. The goal was to test the most plausible natural explanation, a slab avalanche. For decades, critics had laughed at the avalanche theory. They pointed out that the slope of the mountain was too shallow, that there was no debris found at the site, and that the hikers' footprints were still visible weeks later, something that would be impossible if a massive wave of snow had buried them. But the 2019 investigation introduced a new perspective. They suggested it wasn't a massive roaring avalanche, but a delayed slab avalanche. According to this modern scientific model, when the hikers dug into the snow to create a flat surface for their tent, they inadvertently weakened the base of the snow layer above them. For hours, as the hikers ate and prepared for sleep, the wind continued to pile heavy, dense snow on top of that weakened slope. Around midnight, the stress became too much. A heavy slab of snow, as hard as concrete, broke loose and slid down just a few meters. It didn't bury the tent, but it slammed into it with the weight of a falling car. This theory finally offers a rational explanation for the horrific internal injuries. If a heavy slab of snow hit the hikers while they were lying down on their hard ski equipment, it would act like a giant press, crushing their ribs and fracturing their skulls without causing external bleeding. This would also explain the frantic exit, trapped under a collapsed tent with the weight of snow pressing down, and fearing that a second, larger avalanche was coming. The hikers would have had every reason to slash the tent open and flee immediately. In 2020, Russian authorities officially declared that a combination of a slab avalanche and poor visibility was the cause of death. They argued that after the initial impact, the hikers fled to the forest to find shelter from the wind, planning to return to the tent once the danger passed. But in the blinding whiteout of a Siberian storm, they couldn't find their way back. The compelling force was simply nature at its most brutal. To add even more weight to this, researchers in Switzerland recently published a study using the same CGI technology used in the movie Frozen to simulate the snow conditions on Kolatsiak. Their computer models confirmed that under the specific conditions of that night, a small, deadly slab avalanche was indeed possible. However, even with the weight of modern science, many people remain unconvinced. If it was just an avalanche, why was there radiation on the clothes? Why were the Soviet authorities so secretive for 60 years? And what about the missing tongues and eyes? While scientists argue that the soft tissue was lost to scavengers and decomposition in the ravine, the Dyatlov Foundation, a group led by the friends and families of the victims, continues to reject the avalanche theory. They argue that the hikers were too experienced to make such a basic mistake, and they point to the strange orange spheres as evidence that the military was involved in a cover-up. This leads us to one of the most intriguing modern twists. In recent years, some researchers have looked back at the photographs found in the hikers' cameras. The very last frame on one of the rolls of film, known as frame 33, shows a blurry, glowing shape against a dark background. Some believe it's just a camera malfunction, but others insist it is a photograph of the very thing that killed them, a glowing orb or a falling missile. As we look at the evidence today, we are caught between two worlds. On one side is the cold, hard logic of modern science, telling us that a tragic series of natural events led to a horrific accident. On the other side is the haunting, inconsistent evidence that suggests something far more mysterious occurred on the Mountain of the Dead. The reopening of the case was meant to bring closure, but in many ways it only breathed new life into the legend. Whether it was a slab of snow, a secret weapon, or something we still don't understand, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains a reminder that there are places in this world where human logic fails, and the wilderness still keeps its secrets.
As we reach the final chapter of the Dyatlov Pass incident, we are left with a story that has transcended time, politics, and even science. What began as a tragic hiking trip in 1959 has evolved into a global phenomenon, a symbol of the eternal struggle between human curiosity and the terrifying power of the unknown. Today, the names of those 9 hikers, Igor, Zinaida, Ludmila, Alexander, Rustem, Yuri, Nikolai, and Simeon, are etched into history. But they aren't just names on a memorial. They are the faces of a mystery that refuses to die. The impact of this incident on modern culture cannot be overstated. Thousands of books have been written, dozens of documentaries produced, and even Hollywood movies have attempted to explain what happened on that silent mountain slope. But perhaps the most significant legacy is the location itself. Today, the area is officially known as Dyatlov Pass. it has become a pilgrimage site for researchers, adventurers, and truth seekers from all over the world. They stand on the same ground where the tent once stood, looking out over the desolate, beautiful landscape of the Urals, trying to catch a whisper of the truth. But what did we really learn? If we accept the 2020 official conclusion of a slab avalanche, the story becomes a cautionary tale about the limits of human experience. It tells us that even the most prepared, the most brave, and the most experienced among us are at the mercy of a planet that is often indifferent to our survival. It suggests that a single small decision, like pitching a tent on an exposed slope, can set off a chain reaction of events that leads to total catastrophe. In this version of the story, there are no villains, no monsters, and no conspiracies, only the cold, hard reality of nature. Yet for many, that answer is too simple. It doesn't satisfy the heart. It doesn't explain the radiation, the missing tongue, or the orange spheres that lit up the Soviet sky. For those who believe in a cover-up, the Dyatlov Pass incident is a reminder of a dark era in history when governments held the power to erase the truth and seal the fates of their citizens in secret archives. It represents the fear that we are being watched by powers we cannot see, whether they are military, political, or extraterrestrial. To them, the compelling force wasn't snow, it was the system itself. We must also remember Yuri Yudin, the 10th hiker who turned back early. He spent the rest of his long life as a man caught between two worlds. He was the only one who could have been there, yet he was the only one spared. Until his death in 2013, he worked tirelessly to keep the memory of his friends alive, often stating in interviews that if he had one wish, it would be to ask God what really happened to his friends that night. He was buried, according to his final wish, in the same cemetery as the other 9, finally reuniting the group after 54 years of separation. Today, as you look at the final photographs taken by the group, you see more than just hikers. You see a snapshot of a lost era. You see young people full of hope, unaware that they were walking into one of the most analyzed tragedies in human history. Their story continues to fascinate us because it touches on our deepest fears, being alone in the dark, being hunted by something we don't understand, and the terrifying realization that our lives can hinge on a single moment of panic. As the wind continues to howl across Kholat Syakh, the mountain of the dead, it carries with it the echoes of that February night. Science may provide us with simulations and models, but the human imagination will always see something more in the shadows. We may never know for certain if it was a secret weapon, a freak of nature, or an ancient curse. But in the end, perhaps the mystery itself is what keeps their memory alive. By searching for the truth of their deaths, we honor the vibrancy of their lives. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains a doorway to the unknown. It invites us to question what we see, to challenge official narratives, and to respect the raw, untamable power of the wilderness. As we close this file, we leave the 9 hikers where they have always been, suspended between the stars and the snow, forever young, forever brave, and forever a mystery.
The mountain is silent now, its secrets buried deep beneath the ice, waiting for the next generation to ask the question, what really happened at